Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today, Wednesday, January 12th, 2020, we're going to be answering the following three questions in our roundup. First up, how important is 214B in evaluating student visa applicants? Second, are we really surprised 90% of colleges are starting in person this spring? And finally, are there lessons to be learned in these two Canadian provinces, Ontario and Nova Scotia? We'll look at these three questions and more today on the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. As we do each week, we go into the three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last few days as news stories have come in from around the world. And for those not familiar with the Roundup, we take each of the themes we cover in the Roundup from our newsletter that comes out on Mondays, SMIE Consulting's All the SMIE News Fit to Share. That comes in free of charge to your inbox, 9 a.m. Eastern. You can subscribe free of charge at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. And you can just hit the subscribe button there and you'll add yourself to our mailing list for that weekly free newsletter that comes out Monday mornings. We picked those themes from the newsletter. I'll be dropping the copy to the link of this week's edition of the newsletter in the comments section on the Facebook page for our live chat on Wednesdays. If you're not subscribed to the newsletter yet, please do make sure you do that so you get all the news each Monday, so you have a little bit of a head start on understanding and maybe guessing what the three themes and questions we're going to be answering on the Roundup on Wednesdays. So with the first question, how important is 214B in evaluating international student visa applicants for U.S.-bound students? Now, for those not familiar, during the Trump administration, there had been language in the Foreign Affairs Manual, and that manual is what U.S. consular officers use overseas when they're adjudicating visa applicants. It walks them through the steps that they need to take in evaluating each applicant that applies for a non-immigrant visa. And in particular, related to international students, there had been language that was taken out of the Foreign Affairs Manual that related to 214B. 214B is basically the part of the immigration regulations that covers student visa applicants that has to do with non-immigrant intent. That's what 214B basically is a requirement, that an applicant who is applying for a non-immigrant visa category, like a F1 student visa, M1, J1, has to show non-immigrant intent when they are applying for their visa, and basically prove a negative that they do not plan to emigrate to the United States because they're applying for a non-immigrant visa. The way the category is set up, that's in the past has been very much a typical barrier that international students have to rise above in order to eventually be approved for a student visa. Now, during the Trump administration, there was language that had been entered in the Obama administration that allowed consular officers more flexibility in how they interpreted 214B when it comes to immigrant intent or non-immigrant intent for students. That language had been added in the Obama administration to say, hey, as an 18-year-old, will you really know what you want to do with the rest of your life and have well-defined ties at 18 back to your home country beyond perhaps just your family? You're not going to have property. You're not going to have a home. You may not even have a job yet that is guaranteed for you. So for most international students, particularly those that are coming out of high school, going to university in the U.S., to show that you have no tie, that you have no plans to immigrate to the United States when you're done with your studies, even though you have work opportunity available to you as a degree-seeking student through OPT from anywhere from 1 to 3 years for each degree level you study. That to have your whole life planned out at 17, 18 years old when you're applying for a student visa before you come to the U.S., and to have demonstratable evidence of your ties to your home country. And ties to home country is really as it's defined in the Foreign Affairs manual, a residence abroad, property in your home country, that jobs, other investments in that home country that would necessitate a return after studies. So the language that's in that has now been replaced back into the Foreign Affairs manual goes through the context related to visa applicants. And the question here is the context of the resident, and here's what the quote from what's been inserted back in. The context of the residence abroad requirement for student visas inherently differs from the context for B visitor visas or other short-term visas. The statute clearly presupposes that the natural circumstances and conditions of being a student do not disqualify that applicant from obtaining a student visa. It is natural that the student does not possess ties of property, employment, continuity of life that typical B visitor visa applicants would have. These ties are typically weakly held by student applicants. And as the student is often single, unemployed, without property, and is at the stage of life in deciding and developing their plans for their future. Student visa adjudication is made more complex by the fact that students typically are expected to stay in the United States longer than do many other non-immigrant visitors to complete their program of studies, from 2 years for a master's degree, 4 years for a bachelor's, maybe 5 or 6 years for a PhD. In these, and the quote continuing from the Foreign Affairs Manual, in these circumstances, it is important to keep in mind that the applicant's intent is to be adjudicated based on present intent, not on contingencies of what might happen in the future after a lengthy period of study in the United States. Therefore, the residence abroad requirement for student applicants should be considered in the context of the usual limited ties that a student would have and their immediate intent. So that's the more positive piece that was reinserted in, that does give the flexibility to consular officers to evaluate in context what an international student at a younger age is actually able to say with any degree of certainty about their intent to as to what they're going to do when they're done with their studies in 4, 5, 6, 8, 9 years, depending on how many degrees they might do in the U.S. So they is an important, and what they do, the exception to this is, as is written, while students may not be able to demonstrate the same strong ties present in other classes of applicants, their typical youth often conveys a countervailing major advantage in establishing their bona fides. They are not expected to or do not necessarily have a long-range plan and may legitimately not be able to fully explain their plans at the conclusion of their studies. As most students are relatively young and mainly reside with parents or guardians, you can consider a student to be maintaining a residence abroad if she intends to return to reside with the parents or guardians. Nonetheless, you must be satisfied at the time of application for a visa that the visa applicant possesses the present intent to depart the United States at the conclusion of his or her approved activities. That this intention is subject to change or even likely to change is not a sufficient reason to deny a visa. Further, the present intent to depart does not infer the need to return to the country from which they hold a passport. It means only that they must intend to leave the United States upon completion of studies. So that language now being reinserted into the Foreign Affairs Manual and being hopefully implemented and taken on board by consular officers in the field around the world should certainly make it a much easier task for a young visa applicant, student visa applicant, to successfully obtain a visa to come to the United States. So that's really positive news. And I think when you look, and anyone who's been in international ed for more than a minute and has worked directly with students, preparing them for that visa interview, these are the kinds of things that have oftentimes, particularly in most recent administration, were the real challenges. How do we get students to be able to prove a negative, that they do plan to return home? And are they overcoached sometimes in years past to document those ties and show that they're going to come back and have a well laid out plan when it's not really practical for a 17, 18-year-old to have that well-defined a plan before they even get to college and know that what they intend to study is on their I-20s what they'll eventually get their degree in. Things happen, times change, and people change, and particularly in 18, 19, 20-year-old, there's going to be a lot of that. So this language back in the Foreign Affairs Manual is certainly a positive thing. And it's one of those smaller little changes that most folks, they'll just on an outside level looking in, wouldn't really think that, oh, it's not really changing law or anything like that. It's changing how individual applicants can be evaluated by consular officers. And you really have to get granular and know what happens in these interviews and know the kinds of questions that are asked and how little time the applicants actually have to make their case and the few limited questions that they do get asked. So it's encouraging, and if it changes the mindsets of consular officers, and that's really the key here. The language is back in, giving them flexibility, giving them more discretion in this area, even though the law is still the same. That it still says they've got to show non-immigrant intent because that's the visa category that they're applying for. This is a step forward that if this language is taken on board and the message is received by consular officers around the world, it can make the visa application process a lot smoother for international students. So the potential exists for a very positive outcome with this change for hopefully in the fall term when the greater majority of new international students will be enrolling in the United States. So for the newer students, we've had this kind of a real bonus. There's a PI News article that talks through this issue and has some of the associations weighing in on their perspective on this, obviously applauding the move to reinsert this language. And also to commenting on what really the longer term goal would be to make international students an F1 category dual intent. That would allow them to basically not have to justify or have a plan at all necessarily to return home, that they could potentially stay longer term and that could be remove that 214B hurdle altogether. So there's some real positives coming out. We had that for the new students this past week, and previous week we had the waiver of in-person visas interviews for students who are renewing their visas or who have had maybe other non-immigrant visas before but are now coming back to study. They would not have to necessarily do an in-person visa interview, which is something that the consulates abroad really are managing. They're trying to manage things a lot better because they've had staff cuts, obviously with COVID, and are not up to full strength in many places, and even not able to open fully for regular visa services yet. So a lot of good news coming out on the State Department front in terms of how students are evaluated, availability of visa appointments, who actually needs to go for a visa appointment. So some real positive energy coming from State Department lately as it relates to the student visa situation. So that's the first article question of the day. So how important is 214B? It has been everything in the past for international students. As one of the most significant reason why students get denied visas is because they haven't demonstrated properly to the satisfaction of consular officers their intent to return to their home country. So it's absolutely essential. Is it becoming less important? Potentially, yes, depending on how well or how much this change to the Foreign Affairs Manual for consular officers is taken on board to give more discretion to a young 17, 18-year-old. So we'll keep our eyes on that one. Obviously, that's a huge issue for international students in terms of why they get denied, and we'll certainly bring you updates if and when we have more data on this. Second question of the day, are we really surprised that 90% of U.S. colleges are starting in person this spring? Now, we've all witnessed over the last 2 years now the impact COVID has had on higher education, on our world. There isn't a facet of life that hasn't been impacted by what's happened with this pandemic. Though we're not quite yet at the endemic stage where it becomes like the flu that we have. We have a season a year where flu cases increase like it does every winter. We have these surges. We have pharmacies offering flu vaccines. And that's just something that has become a normal part of life. And COVID is moving in that direction, and it is looking like it will always be here. There will always be other variants. And that's something will just become a fact of life that we have to deal with here in the United States and every other country in the world that is seeing cases. And even those that have handled it well in the past, we've seen China is having lockdowns all across their country, at least in 2 different provinces. We've seen record cases spiking in Australia. We've seen other countries. Vietnam recently had spikes in cases, and it got fairly bad there. But with this go round, there's less of a major concern in terms of hospitalizations and deaths as a result of this particular variant, the Omicron variant. There are still Delta variants kicking around as well that are tend to be more serious, particularly for the unvaccinated. What we are seeing, because vaccination rates have increased dramatically, we're seeing a lot more folks who have been vaccinated getting COVID, which suggests that vaccinations aren't the be-all and end-all, but they are certainly an important mitigation strategy by requiring for colleges requiring vaccinations, and eventually many we see are moving in the direction of requiring booster shots as well. So what we're seeing now is we've become we've had over a year of in higher education. The full 2020-21 academic year was spent in the shadow of COVID. Just that last little quarter of the 2019-2020 academic year was where COVID first hit, and everybody was just going out of their minds trying to figure out how to manage this and conduct classes online, and how do you balance having students on campus? Do you send them home? Do you not? How do you deal with your international students? And that's obviously the lens through which we see this question. What we are seeing is, from that experience last year, there were mitigation strategies in terms of social distancing, in terms of masking in residence halls and inside facilities on campus, that in classrooms, obviously, for those that were in person last year. You saw that learned experience on just minimizing the threat of transmission. It's always there. And there were universities, several of which I've spoken with directly about how they were treating the sewage coming out of individual residence halls to determine if any of the COVID tracers were in the sewage from coming out of residence halls, so that then they can identify, okay, we got a spike here, we need to ramp up testing in this residence hall. So this past year, there were a lot of great lessons learned on how to manage a pandemic impacting a college, and colleges that were 30, 40, 50, 60% that stayed in person in terms of having classes in person. A lot of smaller schools were able to successfully do that. You saw a lot of larger state institutions and some of the more elite schools do mostly online and maybe some hybrid. But smaller schools that really rely on having students on campus for funding. They couldn't afford to send students home for a full academic year after what they experienced maybe in the spring. So you saw them largely stay in person last year. They've learned lessons in terms of what worked, and they were able to do so without having to go online. And then you saw folks this past fall with a whole new academic year with a year's worth of lessons learned on how to manage COVID. You see a lot of those strategies being maintained when fall semester started. You see that continuing in the spring. You see with those schools that did pushes for mandating vaccines for students to start in the fall, now seeing that ramping up again in the spring. Those that did more and more colleges were requiring it for the spring, unless there were state law or system decisions that prevented that from being implemented. You also saw those colleges that were online last year. They started in person in the fall. If they had any big surges, they got a little skittish and decided to go online at the end of last fall. Even though we know Omicron is the most highly transmissible variant we've had, but it's also the one that has the least dangerous symptoms or threats of dangerous symptoms for even unvaccinated folks. The symptoms typically have not been as as dramatic, particularly for those who have underlying health conditions, as they had been for Delta or the original variants. So, those colleges that did suddenly go back online at the end of the fall are either delaying their start dates in the spring or starting online in the spring out of an abundance of caution. But the greater majority of schools are clearly not that worried. And there's reason for not being worried. We've talked about the lower significant issues from COVID, the lesser side effects, though it's more highly transmissible. Many of these schools that have these mitigation strategies already in place from last year are now, some of them are even switching up masking requirements to say cloth masks are no longer allowed as a sole protector, that you would need to have either double masked or have a surgical N95 mask type requirement. Some colleges are moving that way to continue to allow in-person classes. So masks will be with us for the foreseeable future for college classrooms. I'm understanding that to be the case for many schools. So we're seeing the impact of COVID. It certainly is long term, and it's certainly one that, though most folks can't wait to see the back of COVID, it's going to be a reality we're going to have in our lives, like we have flu every year. We'll get our regular flu boosters every year, COVID boosters every year. We've been getting after our first 2 doses of the initial vaccine. So it's really something that I think we are really coming to grips with as a new reality of our ongoing reality that we'll have to deal with. What for international students coming to the United States, because of the requirement to be vaccinated for international travelers coming to the U.S., that is kind of one step that they're already having to do that prepares them for campus life. There are a certain number of countries, mostly in Africa, that have vaccination rates currently below 10% that are exempt from that. But colleges hopefully are making exemptions for those students that are coming without a vaccine to get them vaccinated before they begin their classes, or at least get that first and second dose within that 30-day window they have after arrival before classes begin. So we'll see what happens in the fall, where we have a larger cohort coming, where more of these we'll have more clarity on travel by then, I'm sure. But in terms of what this will mean for international students related to starting in person, that's what they want. That's what they came for. They're willing to do part hybrid, and that's something the longer term certainly we'll have to see if immigration regulations catch up. There's been this kind of ongoing, not amnesty, but allowance by DHS to let students take more than one online class per term. They can take, as long as there's an in-person component at some point, they have that option to continue their studies without meeting that immigration regulation requirement. They've given that waiver throughout the 2021-22 academic year. So that would need to continue, and perhaps even be shifted entirely to allow international students more flexibility in terms of how they conduct their classes or can do their classes. And even in some cases may not have options to do fully in person in the future, as some colleges over the last year and a bit, almost 2 years, have realized the value that, hey, these larger lecture halls, we really don't need to have in-person classes for that. We can do those online and then have these smaller discussion and lab sections meet in person. So that's a new reality that I think immigration will need to catch up with sooner rather than later, on a more permanent basis than just an exemption during the pandemic. So we'll see where that one goes as well. So it's I'm not surprised that the greater majority of colleges are starting in person. What I am surprised is how much press those few colleges that are going online, when you get system schools that start doing that, like CSU in California, when you have these elites that are making that decision to go online to begin, when you had some of the Ivies getting impacted, as it did with Cornell at the end of the fall term. I'm surprised they're getting that much press, but maybe I'm not. But it does seem to be getting overblown in terms of the higher ed press that I'm seeing. But certainly we'll keep our eyes on that as things develop. Now, our final question of the day, and this comes to us from north of the border. are there lessons to be learned in these two Canadian provinces, Nova Scotia and Ontario, related to international students and international student enrollment, recruitment, the whole international student management piece, the pathways for these students? We all know in Canada, just stepping back for a minute on a national level in Canada, we all know that Canada has a much more welcoming front and welcoming pathways for international students, clearly defined pathways for students that want to come from overseas to study, then work, and then become permanent residents and potentially citizens. Those are very clearly laid out for overseas visitors that are looking to come to Canada for eventual immigration purposes. Now, that has helped many colleges in Canada that have looked to recruit internationally, that are looking to bolster their budgets to supplement what they are getting from the provincial governments, to really move forward. And particularly on the vocational college fronts, you see that most. I highlighted most by Ontario's college system, vocational college system. That's an important difference. These colleges, when they talk colleges in Canada, more than likely they're talking about vocational schools. Not quite community college, but that's the closest equivalent to them. They're typically 3-year programs for vocational studies that also have work tied into through the pathways that the Canadian government has had. Now, these colleges, these vocational colleges, tend to be concentrated in the larger metropolitan areas. So Vancouver, Ontario is really where the bulk of them are. Quebec, Montreal, they all have large numbers of these colleges that are more vocational, that allow for that really are magnets for international students. In particular, in this first case with Ontario, the major city is Toronto, that it has a number of these public colleges. They received, just to give you an example, they received in 2020-21 a total of $1.7 billion in tuition fees from international students enrolled at their home and public-private college partnership campuses. So the international students made up, at these colleges, 30% of the total student enrollment. Yet the money that they were bringing in was more than the money these colleges received from provincial governments. So only 30% of the students are paying for well over half of the total revenue for those individual public colleges in Canada. And this one is particularly in Ontario that we're talking about here, and the majority of those public colleges are in Toronto. So these colleges' public positions, financial position, was mainly due to international student enrollments. So that we see a lot of these public colleges have become over-reliant on international students for their revenue. We've seen a couple of them in the past, and even at a university in the last couple of years during the pandemic, especially, that fell victim to drops in, particularly during COVID, drops in international students from that was affecting their bottom line and forcing closures of programs. So we have these international students that really have become a real revenue stream for these public colleges, but perhaps overly so, overly dependent. And the dependence is not just on international students. It's on international students, primarily 62% of international students, according to a good colleague of mine, Alex Usher, at Higher Education Associates in Canada. Higher Education Strategy Associates in Canada. His organization, he's one of the thought leaders in international ed north of the border that I really trust and I've gotten to know well over the past few years. He said that 62% of international students in these colleges are from India. 62%. And in the U.S. we're worried we're overly reliant on Chinese students, which make up 30%, 32% of our international student population. So roughly a third. So they're almost at 2/3 of their international students in these public colleges in Ontario are from India. So if anything ever happens in that Canada-India relationship, that spells doom for many of these colleges. So what we are seeing is that without this international student revenue, one college, Centennial College in particular, told the Canadian Broadcasting Company that it would not be financially viable to run without revenues from international enrollment, which is down significantly this year due to the ongoing global impacts of the pandemic. That because there's limited college oversight of international student recruitment in these colleges, public colleges, they are basically using educational agents overseas to bring them in. That they don't have 4 of the colleges of the 11 selected colleges reviewed were found not to have an established formal policy to guide the selection and removal of recruitment agencies. So not having that policy just in place impacts really quality control and ability to shift gears if clearly agencies aren't working, and what you can do. Agencies that make false promises in terms of ensuring 100% success related to visa assurance and guaranteeing scores on IELTS and all that type of thing. So there were a small fraction of agencies were actually identified to have found to have had these issues, but it does create a reputational risk for public colleges, for the public college sector as a whole, when those bad actors become the face of these educational agencies that are funneling all these students to these public colleges. So we'll see where this goes, because it's a really interesting one in Ontario. A lot of potential for more challenging issues to come. Then on the flip side, you have Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is on the eastern. That's one of what they call the Atlantic provinces on the eastern side of Canada. These provinces are not highly populated, that don't have huge towns and cities, that are really dependent on. Have declining demographics, are dependent on this immigrant force coming in for work and for schooling. So what Nova Scotia has done is they've created this study and stay program, where it's really an amped up version of the general Canadian immigration policy that is designed to support, and in the words of this program, it's trademark program, Study and Stay. It's designed to support a select group of final year international students completing their post-secondary studies in Nova Scotia. A 10-month program provides participants with career development opportunities while helping them build strong community connections. Includes managerial mentorship, providing opportunities for students to apply their learnings, network, and gain a deeper understanding of Nova Scotia's workplace, culture, and job market opportunities. It's really as a way to help them have 2 to 3 years of they're really recruiting mentors to be part of the program, kind of like what our career services office does on most U.S. college campuses. It's trying to better integrate these graduating international students into the local communities. So they're really going above and beyond to really sell and promote their province as a real destination that with a much more, well, not much more, it can't get much more friendly than the overall policies are, but to make for a more personal connection with these students and give them more incentive to stay after they're done with their studies, because they depend on that. So we'll see where that goes. And that impacts how these institutions are also handling this current Omicron surge that you see, as many U.S. colleges did at the early stages of the pandemic by keeping residence halls open for international students or finding places for them to stay. Nova Scotian institutions right now are doing the same thing. that they're able to still move into or stay in the residence halls, even though the Omicron numbers are climbing in their areas, particularly in Nova Scotia. So we'll see what happens with all of these changes up north of the border. But you certainly see a kind of a tale of two provinces there going on with Nova Scotia and Ontario. Well, and we'll certainly follow that as things develop. So that's all we have for you this week on the Midweek Roundup. Until next time, we wish you the very best. Take care.